Yes. Oh, this is for you. Okay. Okay. You've never had a cooker? Listen. I've never had one either. I just bought one. That's it? Is that it?
I think David. Yeah. So that's perfect. That's that right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So some of our panelists are not yet with us. We're going to begin this first panel session. My dear friend Ibrahim has been so efficient in keeping the opening protocols to a minimum that we're starting early, which is very unusual at the UN, as many of you will know. So we're going to try and take advantage of that and use this time to hear from our expert panelists, who I will introduce shortly, but then also to open this up to the floor and hopefully have some very fruitful discussions with the diversity of expertise we have represented here today. My name is Caroline Quinn. I am the First Secretary for Africa and Peacekeeping at the UK mission to the UN. As Ibrahim knows well, in a previous incarnation in London a few years ago, I was Deputy Head of our cross-government Nigeria unit, and in that capacity I was one of the leads for the UK government on the response to the Lake Chad Basin crisis. So I'm personally delighted to be here today at this very important conference. I have the great pleasure of moderating an expert panel who are going to, I hope, set the stage for our discussions over the next 2 days by giving us an overview of the very complex, cross-cutting humanitarian and development challenges in the Lake Chad Basin region. And I hope that their presentations will stimulate some discussion here about what are some practical, urgent, pragmatic solutions that can be taken to tackling both the symptoms of the insurgency and the crisis in the Lake Chad Basin, but also the root causes of instability, insecurity, humanitarian and developmental need. So we have with us today on our panel Richard Towell from UNHCR's New York office. We have, this is not Shannon Howard, beg your pardon. This is Paul Skutchilas from World Food Programme, Amelia Hayes from International Rescue Committee, David Carden from UN OCHA. We will have shortly Grant Leahy, who's from UNICEF. And we have also with us a special bonus member of the panel, Steve Toll, who is the UN Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator in Chad. I'm going to take the liberty afforded to the moderator of adding him to our panel. He does have to leave at midday, but I'll hand over to him shortly to talk a bit about the situation on the ground and particularly how the UN's new approach is working in practice in Chad. You'll forgive me, I hope, if I take 1 or 2 minutes just to say something about the UK's personal interest and my government's interest in this crisis. The UK was very proud to hold the pen on the first UN Security Council resolution on the Lake Chad Basin crisis, UNSCR 2349, in March 2017, and to lead the first UN Security Council field visit to the region under our presidency. We're very mindful that we are one of many humanitarian and developmental donors in that region, and tribute has already been paid to a number of the partners here today. I think it's very much at the forefront of ministers and the Prime Minister's mind at the moment that we are now 10 years into the Boko Haram insurgency. And 10 years on from the beginning of this crisis, we now have 10 million people almost in humanitarian need in the affected region. That's almost half the population. That we see 2.5 million people displaced, over 3 million at the peak of this year's lean season will be an urgent or severe food crisis. And there is a real urgency, I think, to our discussions here, because as the distinguished opening speakers alluded to, the governments of the region, first and foremost, have made sterling efforts to address this crisis in partnership with many NGOs, international organizations, foreign governments, civil society domestically. but we still see this complex security, development, humanitarian crisis continuing to unfold and to take a dreadful humanitarian toll. And it's often said that the Lake Chad Basin crisis is one of Africa's most forgotten humanitarian crises, so I'm delighted that we're going to focus on it so much over the next 2 days. I have encouraged our distinguished speakers not to use their full allotted 10 minutes if they don't feel they need to, so that we can move on as quickly as possible to some floor discussion. With that, I will, if I may, turn over to David to give us an overview of the humanitarian situation in the Lake Chad Basin.
Thank you very much. I have a brief PowerPoint which I'll run through. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for giving OCHA the opportunity to speak today on the humanitarian situation in the Lake Chad Basin. Millions of civilians in this region have for more than 10 years been subjected to violence, forced displacement, abuse, and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Triggered by armed conflict in northeast Nigeria, the crisis has spilled over, as you know, into Cameroon's far north region, the west of Chad, and southeastern Niger, areas that are already extremely vulnerable due to myriad of factors, including poverty, underdevelopment, weak state presence, lack of local governments, and climate change. The crisis has had a dramatic impact on the affected population, and this year, humanitarian needs are still very high, and the humanitarian crisis in the Lake Chad region remains one of the most severe in the world. Nigeria remains by far the most affected, being the epicenter of the crisis, but the crisis has also had significant humanitarian consequences in the three neighboring countries. In 2019, some 10 million people across the affected areas in the 4 countries need humanitarian assistance and protection, representing half of the entire population in the Lake Chad Basin. Out of these 10 million, 7.8 million are targeted for humanitarian assistance. Millions of civilians face serious protection risks and human rights violations. Thousands of civilians have been killed or abducted since the start of the crisis. Women and girls face particularly high risks of sexual and gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse. Men and boys have also been kidnapped by non-state armed groups and forced to become combatants. Some 3.5 million people are currently food insecure, as the lack of safe access to farmlands, which has decimated the livelihoods of IDPs, returnees, and host communities. And close to 500,000 children are severely malnourished and require life-saving nutritional assistance. So you can see from this side that the displacement situation remains extremely fluid and complex, with returns of IDPs and refugees occurring at the same time as new displacement. And as was just said, there are 2.5 million refugees and IDPs, a number which has remained fairly stable since 2017. Now, if you look at these maps, you will see that they give the one on one side gives the picture of internally displaced people, and the other one gives the picture of refugees. But since 2019, more than 130,000 people have been forcibly displaced across the region. There's estimated to be up to 50,000 new IDPs in Chad this year, many in accessible areas. around 28,000 newly displaced people in Niger since violence erupted in March, and 27,000 displaced in Nigeria in July. Across the region, some more than 230,000 Nigerians have found refuge in the neighboring countries, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. And persistent attacks by armed groups, insecurity, and lack of basic services in areas of return make it extremely difficult for families and communities to return home. And premature returns are often unsustainable and counterproductive, and risk rendering people even more vulnerable. Now, in terms of the humanitarian response, it is clearly making a significant difference in support of national and local efforts. Today, more than 170 humanitarian partners, which includes the UN, national and international NGOs, are operational in the Lake Chad region. In 2019, more than 2 million people have received life-saving assistance, including more than 1.5 million people with health assistance, 1.4 million people with water, sanitation and hygiene assistance, 1.4 million people with food assistance, and more than 1 million with assistance in protection. And other colleagues on the panel will speak in more detail about our interventions in these areas. But it is certainly true that the humanitarian actors are operating in a highly volatile, insecure and unpredictable environment, including improvised explosive devices, ongoing military operations. And humanitarian workers in the Lake Chad Basin have come under attack, been abducted and killed, including this year, especially in Nigeria and Niger. And the prevailing insecurity has also forced a suspension of aid operations and the withdrawal of humanitarian aid in key locations, leaving affected communities without access to basic services and assistance. And just one example, on 18th of July, an Action Against Hunger humanitarian convoy, that's an international NGO, was attacked in Borno State in northeast Nigeria. One of the drivers was killed, while one staff member, 2 of the drivers, and 3 health workers engaged in the humanitarian program run by Action Against Hunger went missing. Another challenge is money and getting funding for the humanitarian response. For 2019, $1.3 billion is required for the humanitarian response in the Lake Chad region, including $848 million for Nigeria alone. And 7 months in 2019, only 29% of the funding needed to help 7.8 million conflict-affected people has been received. Now, this is consistent with the global average, which this year is particularly poor, but you'll see from the chart that the funding for Cameroon, Chad, and Niger is particularly poor. And if the international community does not need receive the funding required, desperate people will, hunger, water, shelter, hygiene, healthcare, protection, education, intervention in these areas won't be received. And also, communities will struggle to rebuild their lives and livelihoods. And without continued assistance, these communities risk sliding back into distress, which will exacerbate existing tensions and conflict. Now, to address the interlinked problems of humanitarian need, insecurity and underdevelopment, the humanitarian response is being linked with resilience building and greater investment in development, especially at the local level. As reaffirmed during the Oslo conference on the Lake Chad region in 2017 and the Berlin conference in 2018, in parallel with humanitarian assistance, government-led development efforts are critical to tackle the root causes in the Lake Chad Basin. Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria are 4 of the 7 priority countries for the Secretary-General's Joint Steering Committee to advance humanitarian and development collaboration. And closer collaboration between humanitarian and development actors must certainly be supported, and development programs need to be scaled up across the region. Now, discussions in New York on this critical topic run the risk of sometimes becoming somewhat academic. So I think we're certainly fortunate to have Steve Tull here, the resident and humanitarian coordinator in Chad, who can explain what this means in practice on the ground. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, David. Perfectly to time. I will, without further ado, hand over to Steve, and I hope that he might say a bit more about how that new way of working that you just outlined is functioning on the ground, and also how it's interlocking with and supporting nationally owned and led solutions.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for including me in this panel. I'm unfortunately going to have to step out at noon, so it's a good chance to at least give a few points and be happy to join the discussion so long as I'm here. First, I'm really honored to be on the panel with the colleagues from these different agencies, because these are the agencies, plus a few other of the UN agencies and IOM, and quite a lot of international and national NGOs who are the colleagues on the ground doing the work day in and day out to take care of the humanitarian needs, as David was just highlighting, and also provide a lot of the public and social services and protection that the people need. The new way of working, what it means, it really is something that took hold not only around the Lake Chad Basin, with all 4 of the countries, as David mentioned, being identified among the 7 countries by the Joint Steering Committee on Humanitarian Development Coordination Action to be sort of case studies on checking progress and lessons learned on the new way of working. But across the Sahel, it is extremely appropriate as an approach. The humanitarian crisis, at Lake Chad, we have obviously the security and displacement crisis caused by the Boko Haram conflict. But across the Sahel, and I hasten to always add that the humanitarian needs that we're facing in Chad are much greater than revolving around Lake Chad. Lake Chad is 1/4 of our humanitarian emergency appeal for Chad itself. It's the basic low levels of human development in the area around Lake Chad and in the countries across the Sahel, which causes the humanitarian vulnerability at the levels that we see, and also especially triggers real crisis when people are displaced and normal services are interrupted. So we began to take the new way of working, especially engaging more and more with development partners alongside our humanitarian emergency action. We began to take it quite seriously in 2016, even before the World Humanitarian Summit, but definitely we got a boost from the World Humanitarian Summit because it all of a sudden made more sense to everybody. We all operate in the field, all the agencies and donors. We all operate with still stuck a bit in the old frame of mind. Well, you have a department for development, you have a department for humanitarian emergency assistance. You have one agency which specializes in humanitarian crisis assistance. You have another agency which is a development agency. We all still have that baggage, but the reality on the ground is that you see immediately that the humanitarian actors, and this particularly compared to other places I've worked at Lake Chad, you really see that the humanitarian actors are providing basic public and social services to the people. It's the first time. There was a point up here about education and health facilities. In some of the communities, they have been, where you've had, especially in Nigeria, massive displacement of populations from larger settlements. There were public services available, but one of the things about Lake Chad Basin is that many of the population, many of the people have never ever had access to school, never ever had access to a health clinic or a doctor, never ever had any kind of water except drinking directly out of the lake, et cetera, et cetera. So the kinds of experiences that many of them are having as displaced people in IDP or refugee camps, where the first time they're having treated water, the first time their children are going to schools, is a big eye-opener and is actually providing a lot of support to human development and human capital development in the region. So that's the fundamental reality of our new way of working approach, and we're really, I think, doing quite well in the 4 countries in the dialogue that it requires among all the partners to make sure that this goes ahead. Now, a critical partner is the government, of course, and we're all working with local authorities, but also the national authorities. In Chad in particular, we're just at the stage, well, first of all, the aid community helped the government develop with its 5-year national development plan. And we're just at the stage of completing a Lake Chad provincial security and development plan, which draws on that. This is critical that we keep the governments out front, and the Lake Chad Basin Commission was mentioned by the ambassadors earlier as a prominent regional organization which has the mandate to support the governments and development of the basin. So the regional stabilization strategy of the LCBC is critical for giving a coordinated coherence to the activities around the lake, and we strongly support that. I'll just end with mentioning the nexus, or the new way of working approach, is humanitarian development and peace, governance, justice, and security. We have ongoing projects since 2017, cross-border projects supported by the Peace Building Commission between Chad and Cameroon, and now Chad and Niger, to work with the local communities on peace building and reconciliation, conflict mediation. And this is extremely important. So we're looking ahead, and we're pushing the development community to, with the leadership of the government and Lake Chad Basin Commission, to really move ahead with envisioning the development of these communities. Security is critical, and the MNJTF has its hands full with the national forces still, trying to defeat Boko Haram and get civilian policing in the communities. But as soon as we can get an opening, we need to be ready to move in to address the urgent humanitarian needs and put in place some development efforts, especially prioritizing education and health. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. And now I'll hand over to Grant, if I may, who is going to talk about the situation of children in the Lake Chad Basin.
Many thanks, Caroline. Excellencies, distinguished guests, thank you for this opportunity for UNICEF to brief on the situation of children at this important event on the implementation of SDGs in the Lake Chad Basin. Across these conflicted regions of Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria, there are 9.9 million people, including 5.7 million children, who need relief assistance to survive. Of those millions of children affected by the crisis, more than 430,000 are at risk of severe acute malnutrition in 2019, and 450,000 children are affected by school closure. And my colleague David has already shared numbers on refugees and IDPs. In the conflict areas of the Lake Chad Basin, people's daily struggle for survival is compounded by the eroding effects of underinvestment in social services, poverty, environmental degradation, and climate change. Families and communities have little or no access to schools, health centers, livelihood opportunities, roads, or safe water supply. The youth in particular have very little prospects and risk being forcibly conscripted into or by armed groups. Yet LCB countries have made tremendous progress in advancing child rights in spite of significant hurdles over the past decade. For instance, the under 5 mortality, the child mortality has been reduced by 1/3 in Chad since the year 2000, and is nearly halved in Cameroon and Nigeria, and reduced by nearly 2/3 in Niger. But much more needs to be done. Protecting the rights of children above all must be a top priority. Women and children are bearing the brunt of the violence, forced to flee, separated from their families, and subjected to unspeakable atrocities. Children associated to armed groups need to be considered and treated as primarily victims of unlawful recruitment and other criminal acts by armed groups. LCB governments have a responsibility to facilitate the return home and reintegration of these children with adequate care, psychosocial support, and social economic reinsertion. Any detention of children should be a measure of last resort for the shortest time possible and in compliance with international law. While some progress has been made, UNICEF calls on LCB governments to fully implement the handover protocols as requested repeatedly by the UN Security Council. Children separated from armed groups should be promptly referred to civilian authorities for their reintegration. The crisis has also closed or destroyed many schools and left thousands of children without access to education for several years. For example, in Chad, only half of school-aged children, 6 to 12 years, enter school. 50.8% complete primary school, and only 23% attend secondary education. In Nigeria, 19,000 teachers were displaced since 2009, and 645 killed. Approximately 1,200 schools were damaged or destroyed. Basic education services need to be restored to ensure that this group is not left behind in the stabilization efforts. We call on member states to continue to advocate to protect the sanctity of schools. And we encourage all countries in the region to uphold the Safe Schools Declaration, and for all actors to support the implementation of the recommendations. UNICEF is involved in several initiatives aimed at bringing together humanitarian, development, and peacekeeping approaches to strengthen the resilience of people, community, and systems. We need to continue building the capacities of communities and strengthen systems so that they can better withstand shocks, cope with emergencies, and recover more quickly after the crisis. UNICEF is focusing its investments on key results for children, including immunization, the prevention of stunting, and access to education, and improved learning outcomes linked to SDGs 2, 3, and 4. 20 million children under 1 in the world are not immunized for diphtheria 3. Of these, 4 million children remain not immunized in the Lake Chad Basin. Alongside governments, we must raise coverage of routine immunization services towards the 90% global vaccine action plan target. There's still progress to be made with only 50% coverage in this region. Despite large-scale polio programming in recent years, and progress towards eradication, the recent occurrence of many outbreaks in LCB countries due to a vaccine-derived virus is challenging our chances to reach eradication status. This is a matter of great concern. Efforts, funding and support should be maintained by partners to consolidate the gains. The prevalence of stunting is also high in LCB countries, standing at between 30 and 40% nationally. As such, we need to raise the coverage of high-impact interventions to prevent stunting, notably through vitamin A supplementation, exclusive breastfeeding and complementary feeding, all priorities for UNICEF. To achieve these ambitious results for children in the LCB, we must look to transformative solutions and innovative strategies, support governments to strengthen legislation and policy, generate and utilize evidence to scale up successful approaches, empower communities with knowledge of positive attitudes, behaviors and practices for children, build public and private partnerships for a stronger investment in social services, harness technology to bring services closer to rights holders. Partnering with non-state actors is key. For instance, collaboration with traditional and religious leaders, as well as women's associations, proved to be a key element in the response to polio outbreaks in terms of people's mobilization. Given the diversity of the populations, nomadic, Icelanders, etc., it is important to strengthen collaboration and involve them for the achievement of the SDGs in order to leave no one behind. For UNICEF, some 149 million are estimated to be needed to respond to the LCB crisis this year. The funding gaps for the response are 51% for Nigeria, 66% for Chad, 75% for Niger, and 94% for Cameroon. And these figures that I refer to are for this specific LCB region rather than the national funding gaps. Child protection, WASH, health, and are the least funded sectors for UNICEF response, with funding gaps of over 80%. More support is needed. Children and youth are the future. We need to protect them and promote them as a powerful force for peace, looking at them both as beneficiaries and as agents of change. All the numbers that I've mentioned today speak for themselves. This is one of the worst humanitarian crises in today's troubled world, especially for women and children. Still, regrettably, it struggles for the world's attention in the current context with so many other global dynamics. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Grant. And now I will hand over to Paul to talk about the food security situation in the Lake Chad region.
Thank you. On behalf of the World Food Programme, we are pleased to be speaking with you today. We welcome the government of Nigeria's strong leadership in this discussion, bringing together so many actors so that we may consider how we can bring a holistic response to the urgent crisis in Lake Chad Basin. I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome the remarks of the General Assembly President-elect. Nigeria has included zero hunger as a major priority of the presidency. The World Food Programme believes that we can achieve a world without hunger, and we are grateful to the attention Nigeria has made on this critical issue. Indeed, as we heard last week in this very room, globally there are 821 million chronically undernourished people on Earth today. That is up from the year before and the year before that. These are being driven by conflict and climate change. And indeed, conflict and climate change are driving the hunger numbers globally, but also, as we know, in the Lake Chad Basin. In practical terms, this contributes to population displacement and undermines food production and trade, the household purchasing power, health conditions, and as well as humanitarian access. As my colleague from OCHA mentioned, 1.4 million people are being reached with food assistance, but many more people are in need in the region. Insecurity hampers the humanitarian response. and as outlined, additional funding is required. To tackle this issue, we welcome the strong national leadership from the governments. We will continue to provide support, technical and direct assistance to meet humanitarian needs while investing in developmental solutions. Solutions must be tailor-made. We can take lessons from one context and adopt them to another. For example, in Niger, WFP is implementing a forecast-based financing project. When floods and natural hazards are forecasted to exceed a certain threshold, early warnings are triggered. These early warning signals are linked to early actions, and they have the potential to reduce the impact and severity of the response on the population we're serving. The project will support the design and refinement of forecast-based early action and financing tools, directly benefiting the national and subnational disaster risk management capacities, hydrometeorological services, and perhaps most importantly, the 9 ministries that we're all supporting in the countries. But of course, the people we are serving are the ones who stand to benefit the most from forecast-based financing. By reaching them early, they can take control and mitigate the risks for the shocks that we know are coming. But as we must not always look for what is new, we must also look at what has worked over the years. WFP implements food assistance for assets programs in Niger and Chad. These initiatives aim at addressing the most food insecure people's immediate food needs with cash, voucher, or direct food transfers, while also helping to improve their long-term security and resilience. In exchange for the food assistance, they have opportunities to improve community assets and linked directly to rural livelihoods. School meal programs are another example, where WFP can work with its partners to nourish the future of the country, the children. In Chad, this program involves the whole community. A community garden produces nutritious vegetables for the village-run school's meal program. A living hedge that surrounds it protects the crops from sand encroachment, but also from hippopotamuses and elephants. And as the lake waters recede, the animals now can access an area more easily. Thousands of trees, including fruit trees, are being planted to green the desert and to provide snacks for the children. This initiative brings together displaced and host communities around public works projects. These projects are visible and tangible. They're bringing immediate impacts to the communities, and they're showing that displaced people, refugees, and host communities can work together in a positive way that improves food security and nutrition and encourages them to stay in the village and build their future together. This program is one that contributes across the spectrum of the SDGs and is an opportunity to partner with individuals, governments, and the international community to identify local solutions. And these are just a few of the stories, and I know that there are many more stories here in this room today in the organizations we're representing in the field. I look forward to a productive conference, one that first underscores the urgency of this crisis and the need for action, but also points forward to more hopeful solutions that deliver results for the people we're serving. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Amelia, I will just ask David for the clicker.
I can control it with that.
Oh, and then, yeah, just in case. And then turn to you for some remarks on humanitarian interventions in the region.
Thank you so much to the organizers and participants of the conference for including the IRC in this. I'll just give a quick, or try to give a quick overview of the programs that the IRC is implementing in the Lake Chad Basin. IRC is one of the few organizations, humanitarian organizations, that is active in all 4 countries that comprise the Lake Chad Basin. We entered into the northeast of Nigeria in 2014, and soon after started implementing in the neighboring regions of the other 3 countries over the next couple of years. Our program areas across the 4 countries span pretty much the gambit of sectors. We're in protection, which includes child protection, women's protection and empowerment, and protection and rule of law, which is looking at protection monitoring, civil documentation, and other issues like that. We're implementing health and nutrition programming, environmental health or WASH. We're also doing economic recovery and development programming, so that includes cash assistance to help people meet their basic needs, as well as support in terms of inputs, training, and grants to support livelihoods and income-generating activities. And finally, we're doing education programming, both formal and non-formal. And now I'll just give a sort of slice into some of these programs as they're effective on the ground in each of the 4 countries. So of course, the crisis and conflict in northeastern Nigeria was really our entry point into the Lake Chad Basin crisis. As we've already been discussing, the conflict is in its 10th year. There continues to be needs that have not fully abated, with 7 million people in need of assistance in the northeast of Nigeria, 2 million people displaced. Health and nutrition indicators remain very poor. Nearly 1 million out-of-school children. Food insecurity is at crisis and emergency levels, and infrastructure remains weak. So this was the context in which the IRC entered into the Northeast in 2014, and that was actually after we'd entered originally into Nigeria in 2012 to respond to flooding. We're active in all 3 states of the Northeast, 25 sites in total, about sort of formal sites. We're the 2nd largest organization operating across the Base States. We are one of the founding members of the INGO Forum in the northeast of Nigeria, and are seen as leaders in protection, education, and health programming. As I mentioned, we're active in about 25 formal sites, and across all sectors: protection, environmental health, economic recovery and development, health, nutrition, and education. We've ended up scaling up in parts of northern Borno recently, particularly Magumeri, Gwoza, and Monguno, as insecurity and displacement have continued, while we've scaled back some in Adamawa in terms of humanitarian response, and increased our development as we've sort of seen the nexus growing in that area. We've also stayed active in eastern Yobe, where particularly nutrition has remained at emergency levels. We've also remained very agile to respond to other emerging threats, such as the cholera outbreak. This is just a shot of some of the protection work we do with women and adolescent girls in our safe spaces, where we're providing training and inputs, such as supplies for tailoring for women to both build social cohesion, build skills, and also earn some income. Just given the fact that famine is predicted in parts of northeastern Nigeria, I was going to highlight some of our nutrition programming. About 33% of Nigerian children are stunted from malnutrition. So to address this pretty dire context, last year our nutrition team reached over 500,000 clients, and that's programming that's providing activities through outpatient care and outpatient therapeutic points and mobile clinics based in the community, which is particularly useful in harder to reach areas, as well as in static facilities through our stabilization centers, and also through a robust community approach through community management of acute malnutrition, where we're training community members, particularly mothers, in measuring upper arm circumference so that they can identify early onset of malnutrition and refer them to needed services. As we've of course been discussing, the conflict and crisis in Nigeria spilled into the other 3 surrounding countries, and in 2016 we began working in the far north region of Cameroon. Our programming is focused on protection, environmental health, and economic recovery and development. Last year we reached about 178,000 clients through these programming. We have a really strong emphasis on community-based protection mechanisms, which is both to encourage early detection and reporting of incidents, but we've also seen this be quite helpful in having community members feed into early warning systems so that humanitarian and local government officials are aware of upcoming population movements and can respond as quickly as possible. Through our protection work, we've reached over 46,000 people through awareness raising on human rights services available. We're providing direct assistance to GBV survivors, including material assistance, case management, psychosocial support, and we're training both local officials and community members in human rights protection mainstreaming and services available. Just a quick map of our offices in the far north, and we've also recently expanded to the newer crisis in the southwest of Cameroon. This is again some of our protection programming. On the bottom, we work with adolescent girls through a curriculum the IRC developed called Girl Shine, where we're providing specific skills and training for girls through this transitional period of adolescence. And at the top, we're also providing inputs to women such as sort of raw food ingredients to make baked goods that they can sell for small income and just build social cohesion. In Chad, we were actually active in Chad since 2004, but focused in the east with the Sudanese refugee crisis, and we responded also in 2016 into the Lake region. We are providing health and nutrition programming, economic recovery and development programming, and prevention response to GBV. We're actually one of the few NGOs that has bases pretty far deep into the Lake region. I think it's IRC along with ALIBA have the most extensive presence. Through our health and nutrition programming, we deploy mobile clinics, which visit hard-to-reach IDP camps on several days a week, and then we provide ambulances should there be support needed on days that we're not there. We're providing cash assistance to people to help them meet their basic needs, and we're synchronizing our cash with nutrition screening, gender discussion groups, and sensitization on GBV, which is something we do in all of our programming. We tend to co-locate our activities so that we can reach the most beneficiaries across various sectors. We also have a very robust GBV prevention and response, and IRC Chad's programming is really focused on coordinating all of our programming around sustained empowerment and resilience of women and girls. Again, here is one of our IDP sites in the Lake region where we're having an activity, a GBV awareness raising session in the camp, and also training women in vocational skills. And they will later be recipients of business grants so that they can start income generating activities. And finally in Niger, this was also one of the earlier countries right after Nigeria that we went into in late 2014 and 2015. A similar profile of activities that we do there. We run activities in protection, health, nutrition, education, economic recovery and development. We're supporting protection groups, protection focal points, women groups, and peer educators, really with the aim of building up the capacity of the community to be change agents in their own protection monitoring. We've also, sort of similar to some of the education program we've done in Nigeria, recently implemented a pretty robust research project on education in emergencies to figure out how to improve literacy, math, and social and emotional learning skills for teachers and students in crisis settings like the Diffa region of Niger. And on the bottom is an image from that program with students who had received learning kits through the project, and above are mothers associations who are receiving kits for income generating activities. Just to quickly talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing across all of the countries that we're implementing. As has already been discussed, the low profile of the crisis, recognition of it as a continuing protection crisis is a challenge, particularly in terms of garnering funding to meet the needs. Insecurity remains a challenge. As we know, some of our colleagues on the ground have been affected, and IRC also recently lost colleagues in Niger and Nigeria to incidents. Related to insecurity is the challenge of humanitarian access, which is affecting all of the countries, but in Nigeria specifically, we know of over 800,000 people in the northeast area that are not receiving access to aid because they're living outside of garrison towns, and so are not able to access services, and particularly with food insecurity on the rise, this is a big concern. Because we've been responding to the emergency needs and have pretty short-term funding in the grand scheme, we've been struggling to keep durable solutions in mind as we're implementing emergency response, particularly as the crisis has grown protracted. Climate threats are, of course, a challenge that we're seeing compounding the other issues in the area in terms of stretching resources, impacting livelihoods, and protection concerns. And particularly in Nigeria, sort of related to the access and insecurity issue, is the problem of overcrowding in towns, where in the rainy season we see an uptick in cholera and other communicable disease spreading. In the dry season, we had 2 recent instances of fires taking down large numbers of shelters and camps. And in terms of growth areas, I'll try to skim over this because I know I'm running out of time, but we're trying to continue to improve integration of our programming. We know that the problems our clients are facing are interrelated and overlapping. And by mainstreaming protection, cash, gender issues, we're able to provide programming that bestows dignity and choice on our clients and able to meet their needs in efficient and effective ways. Client responsiveness is key to our programming. We gather inputs from our clients throughout all phases of programming, but we know that there are ways we can improve to actually take that into account, adjust programming, and ensure that we're being as responsive as we can. And building local partnerships is a key priority of the IRC across all of our programs and is obviously integral to sustainability strategies. And finally, I just want to touch on a recent report that the IRC conducted together with the Overseas Development Institute, highlighting in terms of Agenda 2030, some of the crisis-affected populations, including those living in conflict, refugees and IDPs, who are really left out of sustainable development goals in terms of language of goals and targets. And that without including these populations in those goals, we're not really going to have data in order to follow up and see if their needs are being addressed. And ultimately, our fear is that they will be left behind. So we've called for a number of areas of actions, calling on world leaders to acknowledge this challenge and take charge so that action can be taken and these populations can be incorporated into the language of these goals and targets, to better prioritize funding so that it gets to these priority populations. And finally, to think of innovative ways that world leaders, donors, private sectors, and NGO can work together to address the needs of these conflict-affected and displaced individuals. Thanks.
Thank you, Amelia, and that brings us seamlessly on to, last but by no means least, Richard, who's going to speak about the situation of refugees in the Lake Chad Basin.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak last on this august panel. Thank you to the moderator and particularly to the government of Nigeria and the permanent representatives who've come out of a hot season to be part of what we think is an incredibly important event to put some light onto an issue which I think others have already said is neglected both at the international level and indeed in terms of funding. So thank you very much for giving us an opportunity. Very briefly, I don't need to rehearse I think the challenges that are out there. One needs to avoid the trap of thinking this is just about Boko Haram, it is just about security. It is really the perfect storm of ingredients linking long-term poverty, inequality, environmental issues, violence, peppered with extremism, government's questions, and now, of course, gang-related violence and attacks against civilians. The point I really wanted to make, and I think it's clear to all, is that there are no quick fix responses. There are short-term, medium, and long-term plans that need to be calibrated and integrated with each other. But to expect to fix the problems that have been neglected, perhaps for decades, in a short term is very illusory. The test of the Secretary General's endeavour to create a more effective system of prevention will be playing out in how effective we are together in regional multilateralism and coordinated action in places like Lake Chad and Sahel, where so many factors are in play. From a refugee point of view, the numbers are relatively, and I use the word relatively because of the extreme and vast numbers of world's refugees today, but about 240,000 people, primarily Nigerians, have found themselves across the borders in the 4 other contiguous states claiming asylum. Of course, the response from a humanitarian point of view also has to be visited on IDPs as well as refugees, but the common feature is that refugees find themselves in having escaped over one border, find themselves in situations of extreme volatility and places of extreme poverty, and places within countries that are well below the average development index of those countries. So these are economically very fragile places, and of course the security situation we've heard a lot about today. It's also clear to us, and I think others, that we don't have a shortage of regional and international instruments at our disposal. We do have a tremendous amount of activity and regional approaches, led by governments. The Security Council has provided leadership through Resolution 2349. The regional strategy itself has all of the ingredients required. So the question is, how does one implement those in a more effective and integrated way? From a refugee point of view, the key ones in the regional strategy, which is led by governments, are life-saving assistance, voluntary, safe and dignified return, and protection of those people who are displaced, but particularly those most vulnerable. That area of work has been taken down to a more detailed level of analysis and implementation by UNHCR. And I want to just spend a couple of minutes just looking at the recently produced Nigeria Situation Regional Refugee Response Plan for 2019-2020. This is in collaboration with a key development partner, which is UNDP, and others. But the key 6 ingredients, if I may, I'll go through them very quickly. First of all, the sanctity and principle of asylum must be respected and is indeed being committed to by states in the region. We do know that refugees, despite the challenges that they face globally, are better protected than IDPs, better protected in legal regimes, and often better in terms of mobilization of the resources and support they need to look after themselves during displacement. So access to asylum is a critical ingredient that we are a strong advocate for in the region. Secondly, and linked to that, is registration and documentation. We do need to know who these people are, to give them effective registration that allows tracing for vulnerable people. It allows effective access to services that they so desperately need. The third element, we've heard something of this, the protection or preservation of the civilian character of where refugees are. Making sure that the military elements that are taking on the extremists don't inadvertently or sometimes advertently co-opt or get involved with civilian populations who themselves are already at risk. So the challenge of getting and supporting governments in policing and security, and particularly for those most vulnerable around civilians, remains a very important issue for us. The fourth area of work under the Regional Response Plan, of course, is addressing the special needs. I think UNICEF, WFP and our good partners, IRC and others, have already identified the challenges of dealing with those most vulnerable children, girls, women, victims of the most brutal sexual and gender-based violence, but also others, the aged and those labouring under various forms of disability need particular support and protection in terms of their access to services. Linked to this, of course, is the environment. The deterioration of the environment is one of the complex drivers, and UNHCR and others, including the World Bank, is exploring possibilities for agroforestry, reforestation and sustainable fishing where it is possible. The last thing anybody wants is to have a growing group of disenfranchised, vulnerable youth in this kind of turbulent environment. So finding meaningful employment for them, to have a living that gives them a sense of dignity and support for their families is an incredibly important peace-building and peace-sustaining component. This all fits very nicely with UNHCR's Global Compact on Refugees. There will be a forum held at the end of the year in Geneva, and these kinds of issues will very much be in the forefront of discussion by states as they look to make pledges and commitments to precisely help bridge the gap. And in our work, we have only 14% funding for 2019 for the needs we require in the Nigerian situation to get greater mobilization of resources. It's often said, but it's worth repeating, that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian crises. There are only political solutions. So unless we have the funding, unless we have the security environment to do our work along with partners, we will have grand plans but the victims and those most vulnerable remain precisely that. So that, I think, is our common challenge today. But I do thank you in closing for the opportunity to share some remarks with you this morning.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our distinguished panelists.